Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this latest in the series of talks from the Royal Photographic Society's Historical Group, looking at collections of historic photography around the United Kingdom. It's my pleasure to introduce our host this evening, Gilly Reid, who will also introduce our speaker. Gilly, over to you. Thank you.
Oh, hello, Michael. I seem to have suddenly lost you. Anyway, never mind. I hope I'll get you back. Yes, I'm Gilly Reid, chair of the Historical Group. And tonight I have great pleasure in introducing Dr. Jill Whitelock, who is Head of Special Collections and Associate Director at the Cambridge University Library. She has strategic responsibility for the library's collection of manuscripts, archives, photographs, and early printed materials. The special collections comprise one of the world's greatest collections of global documentary cultural heritage, collected over 6 centuries, so it's quite some time, and spanning some 4,000 years of recorded thought. Anyway, the next thing is her doctoral research focused on medieval tale collection. And her research interests include Middle English literature, early English printing, and the history of libraries and collecting. So I won't witter on any longer, but over to you, Jill. Thank you very much for doing this for us.
Thanks, Gilly. Thanks for a very kind introduction. Thanks to you, to Michael, and to David Barber for inviting me to give this talk.
Yes.
So, Olive Edis is best known today for her portraits of North Norfolk fishermen, now held at Cromer Museum, and as the first British woman to be appointed as an official war photographer. She's also celebrated for her early adoption of the autochrome technique in colour photography. She called Cambridge her third home. She exhibited in the city and photographed some of its most prominent residents, from women in public life, scientists such as Ernest Rutherford, to the medievalist and writer of ghost stories M.R. James. In this talk, I'll discuss Edis and her Cambridge connections through a collection of her photographs at Cambridge University Library that has only recently come to light. And I should add as a disclaimer at the start that I'm not a photo historian, but I'll also talk about our curatorial practice as librarians or archivists looking after photograph collections and the different ways in which photographs in libraries can find meaning. How do they find a place alongside texts? And how does their materiality help to bring them together? And how do we as curators navigate the path between access and preservation in a way that respects the material nature of the objects we care for? So Cambridge University Library has some 35 prints and 12 colour plates by Olive Edis, a small but significant collection. When I was exploring the portraits collection in Rare Books, looking at photographs of M.R. James, I started to notice a number of photographs on brown card mounts with a prominent embossed Art Nouveau style stamp of one Olive Edis. The subjects were Cambridge figures of the first half of the 20th century. They include, for example, Eva Hartree and Florence Ada Keynes, the first 2 women mayors of Cambridge, the biochemist Frederick Gowland Hopkins, who was jointly awarded a Nobel Prize for the discovery of vitamins, Ernest Rutherford, the so-called father of nuclear physics, Sidney Cockrell, director of the Museum, and then M.R. James, Lost in a Dream, book in hand. Later, I opened a box marked Glass, Handle with Care, and discovered colour plates by Edis. Suddenly, next to the velvety browns of the platinum prints, the unexpected blue and sparkle of Florence Kate Kingsford in Chinese costume. Edis worked with both the autochrome and Agfar processes in her career. Agfar plates only became available in the UK from 1923, so some of the plates can be identified as autochromes on the basis of date alone, but we hope to be able to examine the plates under a microscope to confirm which process was used for each object. As part of the portraits collection in Rare Books, and that's a collection of both prints and photographs. Edis's photographs were catalogued only on cards in the rare books room and only under the names of the subjects. And so the photographs were thought of as little more than a tool to find out what a person looked like. Edis's role as photographer was not noted and was only fully recoverable through the act of browsing the entire collection. As a curator, I was able to explore and handle the collections at the shelf, to open boxes and to be curious. So I could quickly make connections and begin to create a new collection centered around Edis's photographer. Importantly, it is a collection generated and drawn together by its materiality, by the status of photographs as physical objects, and to quote Elizabeth Edwards and Janice Hart, photographs that are both images and physical objects that exist in time and space, and thus in social and cultural experience. Edis's brown photographic mounts with her embossed logo of the clue, a tangible, tactile thread, a way to piece together her work. So, who was Olive Edis? Mary Olive Edis was born in London in 1876, the eldest daughter of Mary Murray and the obstetrician and gynecologist Arthur Wellesley Edis. After her father's death, when she was only 17, Edis took up photography as a way to earn a living, initially working alongside her sister Catherine. And there are at least 3 photographs by Olive and Catherine in Cambridge collections. A copy of a photograph of their uncle John Murray, which was reproduced in 1911 as part of the Cambridge Portrait Gallery series, a supplement to the student periodical The Gownsman. One of the economist John Neville Keynes held at the University Library as part of the Cambridge Antiquarian Society Portraits collection, which is a collection of around 1,000 portraits, mostly photographs, of members of the university or other individuals who were prominent in the mid to late 19th century. The third photograph by Olive and Catherine Edis shows the Irish physicist George Johnston Stoney and is held at the Institute of Astronomy Library in Cambridge. Edis worked primarily in Sheringham and London during the first half of the 20th century, photographing notable figures of the day from members of the royal family, such as the young Prince Albert, Duke of York, later King George VI, and his sister, Princess Mary, and prominent political, literary, and scientific figures such as David Lloyd George, Emmeline Pankhurst, Thomas Hardy, J.J. Thomson. She also photographed the North Norfolk fisherfolk, where she lived, capturing them with an extraordinary degree of expressiveness and detail, and Edis's photographs and some of her equipment can be seen at Cromer Museum and also at the museum in Sheringham. Edis was the first British woman to be appointed as a war photographer when the Imperial War Museum in 1918 to take photographs of the British women's services and the battlefields of France and Flanders. The photographs are now held at the Imperial War Museum. There are also notable collections of Edis's work at the National Portrait Gallery, to whom she donated many photographs, and also at the V&A as part of the Royal Photographic Society collection. And in 1920, she was commissioned by the Canadian Pacific Railway to make colour plates of the Rocky Mountains. The largest collection of her photographs is the one at Cromer, which was purchased with the help of the Heritage Lottery Fund in 2008, and the collection has been conserved and digitised. Further funding from HLF in 2015 for the Olive Edis project led to an exhibition at Norwich Castle and the creation of a permanent gallery on Edis at Cromer Museum, as well as a book by Alistair Murphy, at the time curator of Cromer Museum, and Elizabeth Elmore. The digital collection of Edis's photographs, part of the Norfolk Museum's digital library, is a hugely valuable resource and research tool, as is the Olive Edis project blog, which is still online. And I'm very grateful to Wayne Kett, former curator for Chroma Museum, for permission to use images from the collection in this talk. Edis was noted for her work in colour. She was amongst the earliest British photographers to adopt the Lumiere autochrome colour process, the invention of the brothers Auguste and Louis Lumiere, which became commercially available in 1907 and led to a craze for colour in the first decades of the 20th century, as explored in Kathleen Langford's wonderful recent book, Colour Mania, and in her recent talk on the book for this group last year. The autochrome technique used a screen of microscopic grains of potato starch granules dyed red, green and blue to produce a filter for light passing through the lens on silver gelatin emulsion, which was developed to produce a full colour image. The developed image was varnished and covered with another piece of glass and then bound round with tape, and this produced a very special object which Edis likened to portrait miniatures. Edis won a medal for an autochrome called Portrait Study at the Royal Photographic Society's exhibition in 1913 and was made a Fellow of the Society the following year. Edis's portrait study has not previously been identified. However, by looking at evidence from Chroma Museum and the V&A catalogue, I think it might be possible to identify it as an autochrome from the Royal Photographic Society collection, now held at the V&A, and I'm grateful to Kathleen Langford for advice and expertise on this. So in a printed list of her autochromes, seen here in the middle of the screen, Edis includes one under the heading Mrs. Walthall, Medal Plate of the Royal Photographic Society. The RPS collection at the V&A includes an autochrome from 1912 of a woman holding ferns and a lily attributed to Mrs. Walthall. Perhaps Mrs. Walthall was not the name of the photographer, but instead the name of the sitter. If so, this could be Edis's medal-winning portrait study. However, looking again at the photograph, we can see that the woman's right hand is concealed behind the ferns. A hidden hand can be a classic sign of a self-portrait. The hand holds a remote shutter release, and flowers or foliage were a great way to conceal this, as seen, for example, in this self-portrait by Edis, discussed by Elizabeth Elmore in her blog post, Getting to Know You, for the Olive Edis project. So perhaps Mrs. Walthall is both the subject and the photographer. The RPS donation records list this autochrome as by a Mrs. Walthall and say that it won a medal in 1912, and that's the year before Edis's medal. However, there is no Mrs. Walthall listed among the exhibitors in the catalogue of the 1912 RPS exhibition. Therefore, given that Edis's medal-winning autochrome was definitely of a Mrs. Walthall and dated on or before 1913, it seems likely that this is her photograph. Okay, so moving on now to talk some more about Edis's Cambridge connections. Edis called Cambridge her third home, and her uncle was the Reverend John Murray, brother of her mother Mary, who was Master of Selwyn College from 1909 to 1928. So she had a reason to visit there, and there are two photographs of him in the collection, an autochrome and a print from the same sitting, and this is the print shown here. As well as the reprint of the photograph taken with her sister already mentioned, that's the one of George Stoney, the physicist. Chroma Museum also has some images Edis took of her uncle with Prince Tokugawa Iesato in his guest at Selwyn College during a visit in 1914. Photography ran in the family. John Murray's father, also called John, had been an army surgeon and calotype photographer in India, and John Murray lent a large number of photographs taken in the 1860s by his father for a lecture at the Cambridge and District Photographic Society in 1914. Olive Edis's Aunt Caroline, sister of John Murray and of Edis's mother Mary, gave Edith her first camera, and Edis's portrait of her Aunt Carrie bears the inscription, "My very first attempt at a portrait which turned my fate in 1900. The portrait was given to the National Gallery by Edis in 1948. Over the first 3 decades of the 20th century, Edis photographed members of the university, colleges and city, and the Cambridge photographs form a notable subset of her work, making Cambridge University Library's holdings an important addition to the other collections of Edis's photographs at Cromer, the National Portrait Gallery, the V&A and elsewhere. They display her characteristic command of natural light and her ability to engage with her sitters to produce characterful portraits. Edis used only natural light where possible, so her subjects are often seated near windows and shown reading or occupied with the tools of their trade. They are often subtle and beautiful in their composition, such as this long shot of the zoologist Arthur Shipley, who at the time was Vice-Chancellor of the university. But it's often the close shots that seem especially arresting. Ernest Rutherford up close with the camera, an extraordinary portrait with some of the bravura of Edis's Sheringham fishermen. Or this photograph of the physicist J.J. Thomson, who discovered the electron. With piercing clarity to the eyes, the tactile layer of light and shadow on the silk of his robes. A review of an exhibition of Edis's work in Cambridge in 1926 mentions, quote, "a fine head of Sir J.J. Thomson, which gives a far more natural portrait than most of his paintings, with colour," which seems to suggest that Edis perhaps also produced a colour portrait, perhaps at the same sitting. Her photographs of people in older age show a remarkable sensitivity. Edis didn't shy away from showing wrinkles. In an interview for the New York Evening World in 1920, she said, "The wrinkles, the long nose, the chin that is not classical must stay in the photograph if the subject is to look natural." There is an autochrome print of the Cambridge chemist and spectroscopist George Downing Living, aged 90. Posed reading a book by a window, the natural light illuminating the lines of his face and the individual hairs of his beard. Living had graduated from St John's College in 1850, and he retired as Professor of Chemistry in the first decade of the 20th century at the age of 81. Through Living, we reach back to a time of Charles Darwin. Living encouraged Darwin to publish his work, and we reach back to a time of the emergence of separate scientific disciplines and laboratory culture. Through Ernest Rutherford, we reach forward into the nuclear age. So taken as a whole, Edis's images record a world in transition, a world, like Edis herself, switching back and forth between black and white and colour. There are also copies of her photographs in other libraries and archives across Cambridge. For example, a portrait of the biochemist Joseph and Dorothy Needham at the Needham Research Institute, 2 photographs of Emily Davis at Girton, the college she founded, and one of Adelaide Anderson. There is also the portrait of the Irish physicist George Johnston Stoney by Olive and Catherine Edis at the Institute of Astronomy Library, which we saw earlier. Of special interest, however, is a photograph by Edis of Frederick James Stokely, who was superintendent of the university's chemical laboratory. Stokely was a fellow autochromist and a key figure in the history of photography at Cambridge. This photograph is now part of the archives of the Department of Chemistry, part of the larger university archives held at the University Library. Fred Stokely started work in the chemistry department at the age of 12, and by 1899 was the superintendent or chief laboratory technician of the department. He became an authority on colour photography. In 1901, he exhibited colour photographs using the Sanger's Shepherd process at an exhibition in Cambridge, and he was part of the local organising committee for the meeting of the Photographic Convention of the United Kingdom, which was held in Cambridge in 1902. The Cambridge Convention led to the formation of the Cambridge Photographic Club, and Stokely, who was a founding member, gave many lectures to the club on colour photography. In 1907, he made the first 3-colour photo seen in Cambridge and gave a lecture on colour photography, during which he showed James Clerk Maxwell's original photographs, which had been loaned by J.J. Thomson. His obituary notice in the Cambridge Daily News in 1927 records that, quote, he was one of the first to handle the autochrome plate and produce some remarkable renderings of chemical objects. He was in great demand as a lecturer on colour photography, and his photographic studies have been exhibited in all the big exhibitions. Sadly, the photograph Edis took of Stokely seems a little stiff and is perhaps not particularly successful, but it's interesting nevertheless in representing a meeting of 2 early practitioners of colour work. Also of interest is an autochrome portrait of Edis by Sarah Jane Dugdale Shaw, now at the National Portrait Gallery. Shaw was also an autochromist and had lectured in mathematics at Newnham College. She was married to the meteorologist William Napier Shaw, and there's a photograph of him by Edis as part of our collection. Edis's Cambridge work also included local scenes and architecture. Cromer Museum, beautiful autochrome of the interior of King's College Chapel, and a review of one of Edis's exhibitions in 1926 noted that a view of King's College from the backs, that's the area of Cambridge behind some of the colleges near the river, is an exquisite example of what Miss Edis can do in landscape work. A review of the exhibition the following year, 1927, concluded that the greatest attraction will be the colour photography of local scenes. But unfortunately, it seems that these autochromes no longer survive. We also know from the list Edis published of her autochrome work that she photographed museum objects at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge as part of a body of work of cultural heritage photography, taking colour images of jewels, enamels, and illuminated manuscripts. Some of her work in this area was shown at the annual Royal Photographic Society exhibitions. In 1916, she exhibited an autochrome of William of Wykeham's Mawson Episcopal ring. In 1926, she exhibited an Agfar plate of a Nuremberg cup, and in 1928, an autochrome of a 14th century Persian Quran. She also made colour reproductions of paintings for the Medici Society, as mentioned in a review of an exhibition of her work held at the Medici Society's Dover Gallery in London. And a study of jewellery by Edis from around 1912 is featured in an entry by Kathleen Langford for Philip Rogers, An Alternative History of Photography, published in 2022. Edis photographed Sir Sidney Cockerell, director of the William Museum, on the 4th of November 1932, and there are 2 prints of him in the University Library collection. Both show him in the Founders Library at the museum. Of greater interest, though, is Edis's colour portrait of Florence Kate Kingsford, Cockerell's wife. She was a British illustrator and calligrapher who specialised in creating illuminated manuscripts and later worked as a theatre set and costume designer. Kingsford is shown wearing a blue Chinese costume and headdress. Kathleen Langford in Colour Mania observed how several autochromes in the V&A show white sitters wearing Chinese dress, connecting this interest in chinoiserie with, quote, the opening up of Chinese markets and Britain's increased presence in the area through military and imperialist activities, missionary work, and tourism. And Edis's photograph of Kingsford also comes from this context. In the photograph, the blue of the costume and the jewels in the headdress are shown to full effect by the colour process and are in nice contrast to the dominant reds of scarlet academic robes shown in her other Cambridge colour work. Edis's exhibitions in Cambridge were held at the Heifer Gallery in Sydney Street and at St Columba's Hall in the 1920s. She also offered some of her photographs of literary figures for sale at Heifer's: Thomas Hardy, John Galsworthy, and George Bernard Shaw. Her exhibition at the Heifer Gallery in 1920 featured some of her war photographs as well as portraits, including 7 members of the royal family, and it was unofficially opened by Prince Albert, later George VI, whom Edis had photographed and who was studying at Trinity College, Cambridge from 1919 to 1920. The Cromer Museum has several photographs of the exhibitions at St Columba's Hall showing Edis and her assistants, and these provide interesting evidence not only for the range of Edis's work on show, but also for how the photographs were displayed. As we can see, the prints were hung around the walls of the room, and many of them can be identified. So in one of the images, we can see that Edis was exhibiting her portraits of the Sheringham fishermen alongside famous figures of the day and Cambridge personalities. In this image here, you can also make out her photograph of M.R. James in the corner, and also her photo of J.J. Thomson, top right. The exhibition images also provide helpful evidence to confirm Edis as the photographer of one particular photograph at Cambridge University Library. This portrait of Dr. Henry Montague Butler, Master of Trinity College, Cambridge, who died in 1918. The photograph in the library is on a brown mount, but without any of Edis's stamps or other identifying features. And here we can see the same photograph on display in the exhibition. Newspaper reviews of the exhibitions mention the range of Edis's work on show. From portraits, including those of children and well-known nonagenarians and centenarians, to landscape photography, noting in 1927 that the greatest attraction will be the colour photography of local scenes. We can see in the photographs of the exhibitions how the colour plates were viewed, something which was difficult to achieve with success. The plates required some form of backlighting to be visible, so had to be held to the light, natural or artificial, but Edis's preference was always for daylight where possible. Diascopes offered a safe way of handling, as we can see here in this image from the 1926 exhibition. The plate was placed in the viewer and positioned near a light source, and the image was reflected in a mirror, allowing a close view of the picture. Edis designed and patented her own diascope, as seen here, a small leather case opening in the front like a cabinet, embossed with a key logo which she herself had designed, and this must have imparted a sense of luxury and intimacy to the viewing of the images. Viewing in the right way was critical for a full appreciation of the plates. In her review of the colour plates at the 1926 RPS exhibition, Edis wrote, "The mirror cases would be better not actually against the plate glass window, for the reflections gain very much in quality when withdrawn 2 or 3 feet. The difference between the image by transmitted light and the same in reflection is very striking, as the latter gains by giving an effect of stereoscopic brilliance which is difficult to explain. The plates of greater density especially look best shown in this way, and personally I work for quality and reflection, and the plates thus produced would be impossibly dense for the lantern." Several of the prints now in the collection at Cambridge University Library appear to be actual copies that were exhibited in Cambridge, still bearing the hooks or hanging string on the back and the large captions used to identify the sitters for the audience. And this leads us on to think more about the materiality of the photographs and the photographic process itself. A detailed programme of manual and artistic labour by Edis and her assistants, led by Lillian Page, lay behind the journey from Edis taking the image to the photograph being held in the viewer's hands. And behind this was the labour of what Edis called, and I quote, the patient scientific workers and the great commercial firms who now hold ready to our hands the essentials by which we materialise our visions and who have hewn the steps by which we mount. To a certain extent, this counters a contemporary view that the new colour photography could not be considered an art form because it excluded the possibility of artistic touch. For example, the critic Dixon Scott, writing in 1908 about the new autochrome process, was of the opinion that the exquisite nature of the operations conducted by those incredibly well-drilled battalions of billions of delicate discs makes it absolutely impossible for the human hand to interfere in any way, to offer to aid or to modify the plan of attack, to introduce partial armistice or to release any of the colours once they have been made captive. The operator has to stand helplessly aside while these Lilliputian Frankensteins of his creation automatically conduct their own unswerving campaign. For Edis, however, colour work was an unlimited path of adventure on which our artistic imagination can stimulate us to endless varieties of achievements in which our individualities may assert themselves. Photographic artistry involved knowing how to look as much as how to touch. And in The Lure of Colour, Edis quotes the saying that an artist is one who knows where to stand, going on to add, I find it a very useful rule before ever I touch my camera to walk right round my subject unless it be a rocky mountain. A point comes at which all the colours leap to life and light touches with brilliance the most dead alive subject. By thinking about the materiality of Edis's photographs, we can also see how they occupy a place between image and text. The photographic prints function as text and image, often bearing Edis's embossed stamp, sometimes with her signature, and usually inscriptions on front or back identifying the subject, as well as address stamps for Edis's studios. The autochromes, however, are red before they can be viewed. Dark objects without illumination, opaque, milky dark grey surfaces bound with black or red tape, with no suggestion of the pictures concealed beneath. They're marked with white inscriptions, tiny handwriting in capitals describing what is yet unseen. Dr. Living, aged 90, by Olive Edis, FRPS. Dr. Montague James, Provost of King's College, Cambridge, later Provost of Eton, by Olive Edis, FRPS, 1914. Lady Cockerell, Fitzwilliam Museum, Cambridge, in Manchu headdress and kimono. Edwin Henry Galsworthy of Caius and Gonville College, My Husband, by Olive Edis Galsworthy, aged 76. These are careful notes on affiliation, age, primarily functional but occasionally revealing something more. My husband, aged 76. Edwin Galsworthy, cousin of the novelist John Galsworthy, was 76 when Edis photographed him for the colour plate now in the University Library's collection. They had married in 1928 when Edis was 52 and Galsworthy 67. This is a remarkably candid photograph with his puzzled gaze, as if to ask, what are you looking for? What is it that you're trying to capture? In an interview for the New York Evening World in 1920, Edis said, the face is the index of the character, and the photograph, if you like to put it that way, should be the X-ray of the soul. One is not truly a photographer unless one's work shows what is inside the sitter, as well as what is outside. Galsworthy posed many times for his portrait. Some 20 solo portraits are in the collection at Cromer Museum, as well as the single colour plate in Cambridge University Library, an autochrome at the V&A, and a bromide print at the National Portrait Gallery. This is a nice counterpoint to the many portraits of wives in photographic collections, and the comment in 1914 by the American photographer W.S. Hamburger on autochrome portraiture. My wife consented to be the subject. Oh, these patient wives of amateur photographers, there surely will be a special place in heaven set aside for their reward. By thinking about their materiality, we see as well how time lies across the photographs. Not snapshots of moments frozen in time, but layers of inscriptions, interactions, records of touch. We see this in the 3 photographs of M.R. James in the collection, 2 autochromes and 1 platinum print from the same sitting. The moment of exposure, M.R. James photographed in 1914, the date recorded in a moment of inscription on the edge of one of the autochromes many years later in Edis's careful hand. The moments the plates were developed, covered with glass and bound with red or black tape. The moment of classification by the library of fixing the paper label, portraits.c.60 or portraits.c.65 to the surface of the glass with tape, a moment that ultimately will be undone. For the platinotype of James, the moments of printing and mounting, the moment the address stamp was applied to the back of the mount, the moment Edis's old London address of Colville Terrace is crossed through and the new address of Ladbroke Grove is added by hand. We read these inscriptions alongside the image, but they can also be unreliable witnesses. To the unwary, an address stamp might suggest a date for the photograph. Edis moved house in London after the death of her mother in 1931, her address changing from Colville Terrace to Ladbroke Square, and later stamps on the back of her mounts give this new address. In the case of the M.R. James print, where the old address has been corrected by hand, the mount has been used for a print in response to a subsequent order for a much earlier photograph. If we accept Edis's own inscription as accurate, we know from one of the autochromes that the various photographs of James from this sitting date to 1914. Edis and her husband moved to the new address of Ladbroke Square no earlier than 1931, so this copy of the photograph was issued at least 17 years after the photograph of James was taken. And as it was M.R. James that led me to Olive Edis, I'd like to spend just a few moments more looking more closely at these photographs. M.R. James had been at Cambridge since his undergraduate days, joining King's College in 1882. He was director of the Fitzwilliam Museum from 1893 to 1908, preceding Sidney Cockerell, and in 1905 was elected as Provost of King's College. His first collection of ghost stories of an Antiquary, was published in 1904, and a further volume, More Ghost Stories of an Antiquary, came out in 1911. Alongside this, James published several catalogues of the medieval manuscripts collections of several Cambridge colleges, as well as working on the manuscripts at the University Library. By 1914, when he was photographed by Edis, he was midway through a 2-year term as Vice-Chancellor of the university, and he left Cambridge for Eton in 1918, having been appointed to the role of Provost at his old school. The platinum print of James in a dreamlike pose is a well-known photograph. Edis gave a copy of it to the National Portrait Gallery in 1948, and it's reproduced in Fisherman and Kings, the book by Alistair Murphy and Elizabeth Elmore, that was written as part of the HLF-funded Olive Edis project at Cromer Museum. Finding 2 colour plates of M.R. James at Cambridge University Library from the same sitting was an incredible surprise. One of them is a very close match to the platinum print, as seen here, it's hard to spot any difference. But if you look at James's face closely, really closely, you can see that in the colour plate, his eyes are slightly raised. James was clearly good at sitting still. The other colour plate is a less successful pose. But it's interesting because we can see on the surface some marks of retouching around the face, glasses, and on a hand, and it would be interesting to explore this further and to look for evidence of this on other glass plates as well. So to conclude and think a little bit about curatorial practice. How many times do we need to touch an object before it becomes untouchable? As curators, conservators, or imaging specialists, we handle objects to understand what we hold. So we can describe them in catalogues, appraise them for conservation treatment, and digitize them to allow remote viewing on screen without the need to touch. In some ways, the digital screen stands in for the backlighting by which the plates would originally have been viewed. Although digitization can never replicate the sensory experience of the original, by imaging the photograph's front and back, and by showing mounts and frames as part of the image, rather than cropping to the subject, we can at least record the full extent of the object and its significance. My husband, aged 76. And we hope we can do this for the collection at Cambridge University Library. Ultimately, Edis's photographs will move through this process until they are placed in conservation-grade storage with the goal of long-term preservation through little further handling. Like all curatorial work, this is a work in progress, the starting point of a journey, the moment after gathering together the photographs. The moment before archival cataloguing, conservation assessment, and digitisation begins. Collections move and shift physically and metaphorically and create new meanings over time as we view them through different lenses and from different places within the larger ecosystem of the library of which they are a part. And in thinking of the library as an ecosystem in which photographs can persist and shift in meaning, I'm drawing on the recent volume of essays on What Photographs Do, the Making and Remaking of Museum Cultures, edited by Elizabeth Edwards and Ella Revilius. By taking Edis's photographs out of the portraits collection and assembling them as a so-called artificial collection, we can, hopefully, give them much more prominence and put a spotlight on Edis and her Cambridge connections. The records we create for Edis's photographs will be part of a library's archives catalogue and will acknowledge her work as well as documenting the subjects and dates of the images. They can become a collection of significance in the history of photography, not just a collection of pictures of people. We can go beyond the recording of names in a card catalogue to create a fuller record, one that recovers Edis's role as creator and attempts to convey something of the materiality of production and the subsequent history of the photographs. And in acknowledging how our own curatorial practice is shaped by our own historical moment, we can be more aware of the effect of the choices we make, of our own touch or imprint on the collections we care for, of our own role in their distinct ongoing biographies. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. That was fascinating, and how exciting to have Edis's work within the university library collections. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. I'm just going to kick off with the first one, and I'll come to one that's in the chat in a moment. But just a question regarding public access. So are the public able to look at the photographs and autochromes that you hold?
Yes, they are. So that the library is open to anybody who wants to come in to apply for a reader's ticket and to come in and view the collections. It's absolutely open to everyone. The photographs, the prints, obviously no problem with coming and ordering them into the reading rooms and the special collections reading rooms. The autochromes, obviously, we're at a stage with that where we're being super cautious because of their sensitivity to light. And you'll have seen in the slideshow that the quality of the reproduction there is at this stage very, very basic. We've just done some initial work, and we're seeking conservation advice on how best to move forward with them. So I think it's quite unusual for autochromes to be produced in reading rooms. We would want to have them digitized and make them accessible in that way. That being said, we acknowledge that there is always reasons why people might want access to the original objects. So if somebody had a compelling reason why they wanted to see the physical thing, we would find a way to make that possible as well.
That's great, thank you. And then a question that just occurred to me as you were talking. Do you think there may be more of Edis's work around the university, and particularly perhaps within the Fitzwilliam Museum? Have you taken a look?
Yeah, it would be really great to find more things. What I did when I started the project is I did an email call out to colleagues across the university, and several people got back to me and said, yes, we've got one, and starting to build up that picture. But absolutely, there's going to be potential for more digging. I'd be really interested to follow up at the Fitzwilliam Museum in the archives as well, even if they haven't got photographs there now, just to see if there's any record of the work that Edis did there through correspondence, for example. I think, until you know what you're looking for with these photographs, it's hard to find them because of the reasons I said. The collection at the university library wasn't catalogued under Edis's name, so until you go looking and searching, it's really difficult to know, but it'd be fantastic to find more.
And we've got a question from David Barber, who's asking or saying that you quoted a New York Evening World interview with her in 1920. Did her reputation travel further afield than we might think?
Oh, that's interesting. So, of course, she went to Canada to do the work for the Canadian Pacific Railway. And then she went on to New York. So she was giving interviews in New York. She was also learning how to make films. That was part of her work as well. She made some films. So clearly she was getting some press coverage there as well. Beyond that, I'm not really sure.
Yeah. And then Alan Hudson, former RPS president, is noting Rutherford, Thomson, and Lodge are significant names in the history of scientific photography.
Yeah.
Do you know what materials Edis used for these images?
Materials in the sense of
I guess around the types of process, perhaps, for the prints and any of the.
That's where I'm outside of my expertise, unfortunately, I have to confess, but it would be interesting to follow that up. I thought, yeah, there are a lot of scientists that she's photographing there, and it's really interesting as well, the connections with the Cambridge photographers. So Fred Stokely, who's working at the chemistry laboratory and is doing a lot of work around photographic processes. But yes, that is outside my area of expertise, but really interesting.
Okay, you've got good people on your doorstep as well, so that they can
Yeah.
provide some help regarding process, certainly. If there are no further questions from our audience, and I put a final call out for any further questions. If not, then first I'd like to thank Gilly for arranging this evening, and secondly, Jill, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and bringing to light some new work by Edis. It's been really interesting, and thank you for sharing and giving your time up this evening to share that with us. So thank you, Jill, thank you, Gillian, thank you to our audience for joining us. And just to let you know that there are further talks online arranged in the new year. If you go to the RPS website and filter by historical group, then you'll be able to see those. And there's also a number of live visits, including a visit to Laycock with the curator and the London Stereoscopic Company, who will be talking there in the spring. And we also have a research day in partnership with the University of Wolverhampton. So please check out the RPS website. Again, thank you, Jill, and thank you, Gilly, for arranging this evening. Thank you. Good night, everyone.